Back in the 80s, it never occurred to some game developers that their games would spawn ongoing, narrative-driven franchises. Stories always took a back seat to the gameplay and mechanics that created some of the most classic gaming memories. While some franchises began following a single unified canon, Nintendo was uncompromising when designing for its flagship adventure game. For Shigeru Miyamoto and his team, the world you were playing in was far more important than the reason you were playing in it. Series canon was an afterthought to the game concepts that would power each new Zelda release. Following this philosophy, Link was redrawn for a new generation, bringing a tidal wave of new lore that forever altered the stories Zelda timeline theorists had grown to love. In 2003, Nintendo opened the floodgates and revealed The Wind Waker, and showed players a drastically re-envisioned Hyrule. Nintendo said that the game, which took place hundreds of years after the events of Ocarina of Time, told the tale of the downfall of the kingdom, and the return of Ganon after being sealed away at the end of Ocarina of Time. Rather than let its proud lands fall into the hands of evil, the gods of Hyrule instead decided to submerge it in a great flood. Several generations later, Ganon used the Triforce of Power, broke free from his prison below the waves, and sought the means to unify the Triforce and make his dark wishes come true. A new hero was born, and along with Zelda's descendant, rose to stop the evil menace. In the end, the Triforce washed away the remnants of Hyrule once and for all, and brought what appeared to be a conclusive end to the ancient kingdom. The finale was a confusing twist for timeline theorists. Ganon was defeated when Link thrust the Master Sword into his head, and the blade was washed away in the Dark Abyss along with the rest of Hyrule. With the kingdom submersed in water, it was tough to rationalize it as a setting for future games. Some theorists speculated that there would be a game in the future that would fill these perceived plot holes. Others had a more radical theory. What if there were two timelines as a result of the events in Ocarina of Time? These theorists surmised that at the end of Ocarina of Time, Zelda sent Link back in time to the day they met. This action effectively created a second timeline, which continued with Majora's Mask. However, the princess in the future who sent Link back in time persisted in her own timeline. According to these fans, what transpired in her reality led to the fall of Hyrule and Great Flood preceding the Wind Waker. So which of these timelines, if either, was established as Zelda canon? An interview with the minds behind The Legend of Zelda proved to be elusive. Eventually, they were questioned on the series canon following The Wind Waker, in which they confirmed there were indeed two parallel timelines in the Zelda universe. However, most of the development team only spoke Japanese, so their remarks had to be translated into English. At the time, Nintendo of America had a shady track record with its localization, so some doubted the accuracy of their answers regarding these two timelines. 2004's Four Swords Adventures for the GameCube was a continuation of the story in Four Swords. Vati broke free from his imprisonment within the Four Sword, and it was up to Link to defeat the Wind Mage once again. After finally confronting the villain, Ganon emerged from the shadows and revealed himself as the true culprit. Teaming up with Zelda, Link thwarted Ganon's scheme and restored peace. The numerous references to Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past made for yet another undecipherable puzzle for timeline theorists and made them question, once again, if an overarching timeline truly existed. Nintendo followed up Four Swords Adventures with a Minish Cap for the Game Boy Advance. The game was a prequel to Four Swords, revealing the origins of Vati. Given it was a prequel, it took place before the events of Four Swords. At this point, though, given how little direct connection the Minish Cap, Four Swords, and Four Swords Adventures had with the rest of the series, some timeline theorists discarded these three games from their Zelda canon altogether. The the ongoing Legend of Zelda took a dark turn in the events of 2006's Twilight Princess. In the game's backstory, Ganon was banished to another dimension called the Twilight Realm, but generations later, he managed to break free. A new Link and Zelda joined forces with Midna, the deposed princess of the Twilight Realm, and the trio vanquished Ganon. Nintendo maintained that both The Wind Waker and Twilight Princess were sequels to Ocarina of Time, which, given the drastically differing settings of both games, made a single timeline implausible for timeline theorists. Supporters of the split timeline were vindicated when Eiji Onuma came forth after the game's release and confirmed once and for all that there were two Zelda timelines. The history of Hyrule forked in two different directions at the end of Ocarina of Time. The Wind Waker took place after the future events in Ocarina of Time, and Twilight Princess transpired in a second timeline created when Link time traveled and warned Zelda about Ganon, which averted the events of Ocarina of Time. The confirmation of a split timeline solved many of the problems that had stumped theorists, but the timeline placement of games like A Link to the Past and the original Legend of Zelda remained elusive. Nintendo brought the flooded Hyrule timeline back into focus with its next two releases. 2007's Phantom Hourglass was a direct sequel to The Wind Waker, where Link and Zelda were in the middle of their journey to find a new land when they came across a mysterious ghost ship. While exploring the ship, the duo was drawn into a mysterious world which was being threatened by an evil being called Bellum. Link ultimately rescued Zelda and saved the day. Eventually, they returned to their own ship and continued their quest to find a home, which was the setting of the next adventure. In 2009's Spirit Tracks, we learned that the crew finally found its way to a new land and christened it a New Hyrule. Several generations passed and a plot was hatched to free an ancient evil shackled by the magical spirit tracks that dotted the land. A new Link and Zelda rose up to take on this foe called Malladus, and they ultimately defeated the demon and returned peace to the New Hyrule. For the first time ever, Nintendo was continuing an arc through multiple direct games, and their placement was easy to discern. Those who followed the events of The Wind Waker were rewarded with an ongoing tale atypical for the series. But the trend was short-lived. In 2011, Nintendo released the latest entry in the series, Skyward Sword. For a long time, theorists speculated where the game took place in their timeline, and some hoped it would fill in some of its gaps. The game ended up taking place at the beginning of the timeline, and served as the foundation for many of the events that transpired in the other games. Skyward Sword was the origin story for the Master Sword. Link forged the blade over the course of the game, and it ended up containing the spirit of his companion Fi. Skyward Sword shone some light on key mysteries. For starters, it was revealed that the main antagonist, Demise, was the precursor to series villain Ganon. Demise promised his spirit would endure and that he'd be reincarnated. We also learned that there was a goddess named Hylia, who after a great war sacrificed her divine powers and became the mortal Zelda. This explained why the long line of those who bore the name Zelda had divine powers and guarded the Triforce. Skyward Sword marked the 25th anniversary of The Legend of Zelda. To some, the games were classic stories of a damsel in distress, but to Zelda timeline theorists, it was a mythology that spanned thousands of years and alternate realities. For decades, rationalizing Zelda's continuity was a daunting task for those who took it upon themselves to find meaning in what many argued were just discrete games not meant to construct a single canonical timeline. Shigeru Miyamoto's philosophy of putting design and gameplay before story made these games classics, but to theorists, questions haunted their experience with each new release. Was there an official Zelda timeline? How could it possibly fit together? Would the franchise live up to its name and be just a series of legends loosely connected by an enduring mythos? Would Nintendo ever reveal the truth?